10 years of marriage feels like a lifetime when you've built your life on promises of forever. That's what I thought as I stood on the porch of our small suburban home, keys in hand, hesitating to turn the lock. The lights inside glowed warmly, a stark contrast to the chill seeping into the evening air. Yet, for reasons I couldn't quite pinpoint, something about stepping through that door felt heavier than usual. We had met at a charity fundraiser, a swanky event far above my tax bracket. Back then, Emily was radiant, all bright smiles and graceful gestures, the kind of woman who could make you feel like the most important person in the room. I was just a guy with ambition but not much to show for it yet. Despite my modest means, she had chosen me, and for a decade, I believed that choice was based on something deeper than the zeros in a bank account. I turned the key and walked into the familiar scent of vanilla candles and the faint echo of Emily's favorite jazz playlist drifting from the kitchen. She was seated at the dining table, her laptop open, with a glass of wine in hand. She glanced up, her lips curling into a soft smile. "You're home late," she said, her tone casual, but there was something clipped beneath the warmth. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down by the door. "Work ran over. Clients wanted revisions." The silence that followed felt stretched, her eyes flickering back to the laptop screen. It was the kind of pause that made you question whether everything was as fine as it appeared. We ate dinner together, our conversation polite but superficial, updates about her fitness studio, my work, the neighbor's new dog. It felt like a performance we'd been perfecting for years. But that night, as I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unraveling, slowly and quietly, just out of sight. A week later, I found the first thread. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. Just a receipt left in her car, a lunch at an upscale restaurant neither of us could afford casually. I dismissed it, chalking it up to a client meeting or a splurge with friends. But then, more receipts surfaced, along with unexplained hours where she was at the gym or running errands. The turning point came on a Tuesday. My job required long hours, but I had wrapped up early that day and decided to surprise her at the gym. Emily had always been disciplined about her fitness, but something had shifted in the last year. She spent more time there, and her enthusiasm for working out seemed newly charged. I wanted to support her and thought showing up unannounced would be a sweet gesture. But when I arrived, her car wasn't there. I called her, and when she answered, her voice was steady, not betraying a hint of panic. "Oh, I just finished up," she said. "I'm grabbing coffee with a friend. Be home soon." I hung up, staring at the gym's parking lot, trying to convince myself that nothing was amiss. But deep down, a seed of doubt had already been planted. The next morning, I tried to shake the unease, telling myself it was paranoia. But the nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. When Emily left for work, I stayed behind, telling her I wasn't feeling well. I needed time to think, to piece together the fragments of doubt swirling in my mind. It wasn't until I started looking through our bank statements that the cracks widened. Charges to places I didn't recognize, restaurants, spas, even a hotel, caught my eye. Some could have been explained away, but others? No way. One in particular stood out, a high-end jewelry store receipt for a bracelet. A bracelet I'd never seen her wear. I stared at the screen, my stomach sinking. She was meticulous about her spending and never mentioned buying jewelry. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to confront her outright or dig deeper. In the end, I decided to wait. I needed more than suspicion. I needed the truth. That evening, she walked through the door like nothing was wrong, flashing me the same bright smile I'd fallen for years ago. I wondered if she could see the questions in my eyes, the way my gaze lingered on her a beat too long. "How was your day?" she asked, placing her purse on the counter and kissing my cheek. "Good," I replied, forcing a smile. "You?" She paused for a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that says more than words ever could. "Busy," she said finally, her voice breezy. "Clients are keeping me on my toes." I nodded, letting the conversation drift into the usual rhythm. But every word she spoke felt hollow, like it was masking something else. Something darker. A week later, I followed her. It wasn't something I ever imagined doing. We had built our relationship on trust, or so I thought. But trust had become a fragile thing, slipping through my fingers the more I tried to cling to it. That day, I told her I was working late. In truth, I left the office early and parked 2 blocks from her gym, waiting. An hour passed. Then 2. My heart raced as I imagined every possibility, from innocent to damning. Finally, I saw her emerge, but she wasn't alone. A man, tall, athletic, and sharply dressed, walked beside her, their laughter carrying across the parking lot. They looked comfortable. She touched his arm as they reached his car, and I saw him lean closer, whispering something that made her laugh again. When she glanced around, I ducked lower in my seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at me to confront her, but I stayed put, watching as they drove off together. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding as their car wound through the city streets. They pulled into the parking lot of an upscale restaurant, the kind we only ever visited for anniversaries. She looked radiant, stepping out of the car with the kind of glow I hadn't seen in years. The man held the door open for her, and they disappeared inside. I stayed in my car, frozen. I sat there, staring at the restaurant's entrance, trying to convince myself this wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was just a business dinner. Maybe he was a client or a mentor. But the way she laughed with him, the way her hand lingered on his arm, it felt too intimate, too familiar. I wanted to march in and demand answers, to turn their idyllic evening into a scene of confrontation. But instead, I sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to think. I needed to be sure. The next day, I made a call. A friend of mine, Tim, worked as a private investigator. We weren't close, but we'd kept in touch over the years. When I explained the situation, his response was blunt. "If you want answers, I'll get them. But be ready for whatever we find." "You sure you want this?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to stay in the safety of doubt, where I could cling to the possibility that I was wrong. But I knew the truth was already gnawing at me, and ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. "Do it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Tim moved quickly. Over the next week, he gathered evidence, photos, timestamps, receipts. He didn't share much until he had the full picture, but when he finally called me in to review the findings, I felt the weight of his words before he even spoke. "She's been seeing him for months," he said. "His name's Mark. Works as a regional manager for some fitness chain." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, Emily and Mark at the restaurant, walking hand in hand through a park, sitting side by side in his car. The shots were clear, undeniable. But what broke me wasn't the pictures. It was the text messages Tim had managed to recover. In one, she wrote, "You make me feel alive in a way I haven't in years." Another read, "He's a good man, but he doesn't excite me like you do." I sat there, staring at the words, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. The life we'd built, the memories we'd shared, it all felt like a cruel joke. How long had she been feeling this way? And why hadn't she told me? Tim's voice broke through my thoughts. "I'm sorry, man. I know this isn't easy." I nodded, unable to speak. I felt like a spectator in my own life, watching it crumble in slow motion. That evening, I went home and tried to act normal. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed time to process, to figure out my next move. Emily greeted me with the same warm smile, the same kiss on the cheek, as if nothing had changed. And for a moment, I almost believed her. But as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't help but see her differently. Every laugh, every word felt rehearsed, like she was playing a part in a story I no longer recognized. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but instead, I stayed quiet, my anger simmering beneath the surface. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built my life around, was slipping away. And I had no idea how to stop it. Over the next few days, I moved through life on autopilot. The evidence Tim had shown me played on a loop in my mind. Every smile Emily gave me, every casual, "How was your day?" felt like a knife twisting deeper. I couldn't decide what was worse, the betrayal itself or the way she carried on as if nothing had changed. One evening, I found myself standing in front of her phone as it charged on the counter. She was upstairs in the shower, the sound of running water masking my movements. My hand hovered over it, hesitating. I'd never invaded her privacy like this before, but I needed confirmation. I needed to know if there was any part of her that still cared about us. Unlocking the phone was easy, we'd shared our passwords years ago. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages, looking for Mark's name. I found it buried under a contact labeled Megan, a clever disguise, but not clever enough. The thread was a litany of secrets, plans for weekend getaways, playful teasing, and, worst of all, messages dripping with affection. One in particular made my stomach churn. "I'll tell him when the time is right. I just need a little more time." Tell me. Tell me what? That she was leaving. That she loved him. My hands trembled as I locked the phone and placed it back on the counter. I walked out of the house, needing air, needing space, needing to escape the suffocating weight of her lies. I drove aimlessly for hours that night, the streets blurring past as I tried to make sense of it all. How had we gotten here? I replayed every moment of our marriage, searching for signs I might have missed, her growing distance, the way she seemed happier away from home, the subtle shifts in her tone when she spoke to me. The signs had been there all along, but I'd been too blind to see them. By the time I returned home, it was well past midnight. Emily was asleep, her face serene in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at her. I wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers. But instead, I turned and went to the couch, my mind too restless for sleep. The next morning, Emily was her usual cheerful self, humming softly as she made breakfast. I watched her from across the kitchen, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the one who had betrayed me. "You okay?" she asked, catching my gaze. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went back to whisking eggs. It struck me then how easily she lied, how effortlessly she played her part. I wondered if I'd ever really known her at all. That afternoon, I called Tim again. "I need more," I told him. "I need to know what she's planning." Tim was hesitant. "Are you sure? You've already got enough to confront her. Digging deeper might make it worse." "Worse?" I laughed bitterly. How much worse could it get? He sighed but agreed to keep looking. "Just be ready, man. Once you open this door, there's no going back." A week later, Tim called with an update. His tone was grim. "She's planning to leave," he said. "She's been meeting with a divorce attorney." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. For all the evidence I'd gathered, part of me had clung to the hope that we could fix this. But now, that hope was gone. Tim continued, his voice cautious. "She hasn't filed anything yet, but she's moving money around. Small amounts, spread across different accounts. Looks like she's trying to protect herself financially." I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. Emily was making her move, and I had a choice to make. I could confront her now, armed with everything I knew, or I could play along, waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. I decided to wait. Confronting Emily then, with emotions running high, would have been reckless. Instead, I began making quiet preparations of my own. I contacted a lawyer and laid everything on the table, the evidence Tim had gathered, the financial records I'd started tracking, even my suspicions about her long-term plans. My lawyer, an older man with a calm, measured demeanor, leaned back in his chair as he spoke. "You're in a good position," he said. "You've got proof of infidelity, and if she's shifting assets, we can use that. But patience is key. Let her make the first move." So I waited. I kept going to work, acting as though nothing had changed, even as every interaction with Emily felt like walking through a minefield. At night, I'd lie awake on the couch, replaying our past in my mind. The vacations, the birthdays, the lazy Sunday mornings. All of it felt tainted now, hollowed out by the truth. One evening, Emily mentioned she was heading to a friend's house for wine and a movie. It was the kind of excuse I'd stopped believing weeks ago, but I smiled and wished her a good time. As soon as she left, I texted Tim. He was already on standby. A few hours later, he called me. "She's with him," he said simply. I clenched my fist, the words burning like acid. "Where?" "At a hotel downtown. They've been there for hours." I hung up, my heart pounding. This was it. The confirmation I didn't want but knew I needed. When Emily returned home late that night, she slipped through the door quietly, as if trying not to wake me. But I was wide awake, sitting in the darkened living room. "Hey," I said, my voice startling her. "Oh, you're still up," she said, her tone light, almost cheerful. "How was your night?" I stared at her for a long moment, fighting the urge to confront her right then and there. Instead, I simply said, "Fine." "Yours?" "Good," she replied, smiling as she headed upstairs. I watched her go, feeling the weight of everything I knew pressing down on me. She thought she was in control, that she was pulling the strings. But she had no idea what was coming. The following day, I called my lawyer. It was time to act. We discussed the next steps, filing for divorce, freezing joint accounts, and securing evidence that could tilt the case in my favor. He assured me that the process would move quickly once initiated, but I had one more condition. I wanted to confront Emily on my terms, in a way she couldn't deny or twist. "Make sure your assets are protected before you do anything," my lawyer warned. "Once you reveal what you know, things could escalate." I spent the next week preparing. I set up a separate bank account and moved my savings discreetly, ensuring that Emily couldn't access a cent. I also began quietly moving personal items out of the house, small things she wouldn't notice right away. Every step was deliberate, calculated. One night, I made an excuse to leave work early and met with Tim. He handed me a flash drive with the culmination of his investigation, photos, videos, and financial records that painted a clear picture of her betrayal. "This is everything," Tim said. "You've got enough to confront her, and win." "Thanks," I said, gripping the drive tightly. "I'll handle it from here." That weekend, I invited Emily out for dinner. She seemed surprised but pleased, and for a moment, I saw the version of her I had fallen in love with, the way her eyes lit up, the easy way she laughed. It was bittersweet. Over dessert, I looked her in the eye and asked, "Are you happy, Em?" She paused, her smile faltering. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "No reason," I said, forcing a smile. "Just curious." As we drove home, she reached for my hand. "I'm glad we did this," she said softly. "We needed it." I nodded, saying nothing. Inside, I was bracing for what came next. A few days later, I came home early, my heart racing as I prepared for the moment I had been dreading, and anticipating. Emily was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, humming softly. For a second, I hesitated. Could I really go through with this? But then the memory of her with him flashed in my mind, and my resolve hardened. "Emily," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk." She turned, knife in hand, looking puzzled. Sure, what's up? I sat at the table and gestured for her to join me. Sit down. Her smile wavered, and she set the knife down, wiping her hands on a towel before taking a seat across from me. You're scaring me. What's going on? I pulled out the flash drive Tim had given me and set it on the table between us. I know about you and Mark. Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. I don't know what you're talking about, she finally said, her voice shaky. I leaned forward, my gaze locked on hers. Don't lie to me, Emily. I've seen the photos. I've read the messages. I know everything. Her eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't mean for it to happen, she sobbed. I swear, Alex, it just happened. I sat back, watching her crumble. It was a strange, hollow feeling. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to reassure her that everything would be okay. But another part of me, the part that had been betrayed, wanted her to feel every ounce of the pain she had caused. How long? I asked coldly. She sniffled, wiping her eyes. 6 months, she whispered. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of sneaking around, of pretending everything was fine. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to yell. Why, Emily? What was I not enough? She shook her head frantically. It wasn't about you. You're a good man, Alex. I needed something else. Something exciting. Her words cut deeper than I expected. And you thought Mark could give you that? I asked, my voice icy. She didn't respond, her silence speaking volumes. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, standing up. I'm filing for divorce. You'll hear from him soon. Emily's head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. No. Alex, please. We can fix this. I'll end it with him. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head. It's too late, Emily. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. As I walked out of the kitchen, her sobs echoed behind me. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The life we had built together was over, but I was finally ready to start rebuilding, without her. The days following our confrontation were a blur of paperwork, meetings with my lawyer, and awkward silence at home. Emily tried to reach out, her voice shaky with desperation as she pleaded for a second chance. But my mind was made up. Every time I looked at her, all I could see were the lies, the betrayal, and the man she had chosen over me. Alex, please, she said one evening, standing in the doorway of the living room. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever you want. Just, don't give up on us. I turned to her, my expression hard. You gave up on us the moment you chose him, Emily. This isn't something we can come back from. She flinched as if I'd struck her, then turned and walked away. I heard her bedroom door close softly, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't my guilt to carry. As the divorce proceedings began, I threw myself into work, pouring every ounce of energy into my projects. The long hours were a welcome distraction, giving me a sense of purpose when everything else felt chaotic. Meanwhile, Emily moved out of the house. She didn't take much, just her clothes and a few personal items. The rest she left behind, a stark reminder of the life we had shared. As I boxed up her things, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we had lost. One evening, I stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away in the closet. It was filled with pictures of us, smiling at the beach, celebrating holidays, holding hands on our wedding day. I closed the album quickly, unable to bear the memories. That chapter of my life was over, and it was time to let it go. Then, something unexpected happened. About a month after Emily moved out, I received a call from an investor who had taken an interest in one of my projects. They wanted to back it, and the funding they offered was life-changing. Overnight, my modest startup transformed into a thriving business. I worked harder than ever, but this time, it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a new beginning. The next few months were a whirlwind. The investment breathed new life into my company, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something that truly mattered. I hired a small team, expanded our operations, and watched as our success began to snowball. In those hectic weeks, something unexpected happened. I started to feel alive again. It wasn't just the money or the growth of the business, it was the sense of control, of moving forward instead of standing still. Emily tried to contact me a few times during this period. She left voicemails, sent long, emotional emails, and even showed up at the house once, begging for a chance to explain herself. "Alex," she said through tears, standing on the porch one evening. "I made a mistake. I see that now. Please, can't we just talk?" I looked at her, calm but resolute. "There's nothing left to say, Emily. We're done." She didn't argue. Instead, she nodded, wiping her tears as she walked away. It was the last time I saw her. As the divorce was finalized, I moved out of the house. It had become a symbol of everything I wanted to leave behind. I bought a sleek new condo downtown, closer to the office, and filled it with clean lines and modern furniture, no traces of the life I'd lived with Emily. For the first time in years, I started focusing on myself. I joined a gym, took up running, and even signed up for cooking classes. It felt strange at first, learning how to navigate life as a single man again. But with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more sure of who I was without her. And then, one day, life threw me another twist. I met Rachel. She was a teacher, warm and vibrant in a way that immediately drew me in. We met at a charity event, ironically the same kind of place where I'd first met Emily all those years ago. But Rachel was different. She didn't care about wealth or status. She cared about people, about making a difference. Our first date was simple, a walk through the park, followed by coffee at a small, cozy cafe. By the time we said goodnight, I realized I hadn't thought about Emily once. Rachel and I grew closer over the months, our connection deepening in ways I hadn't thought possible after everything I'd been through. She brought light into my life, her laughter filling the spaces that had once been hollow and quiet. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not for what I could provide or achieve, but for who I was. She didn't care about my past or the wealth I'd accumulated. She cared about the little things, my love for cooking, my terrible sense of humor, and the way I always forgot where I left my keys. By the time our one-year anniversary rolled around, I knew she was the one. Life continued to move forward. My company flourished, and Rachel and I built a life together. We bought a house, a modest one compared to the mansion Emily used to dream about, and filled it with warmth and love. A couple of years later, we welcomed our first child, a boy we named Caleb. Holding him for the first time, I felt a kind of joy that eclipsed every pain I had endured. Rachel and I watched him grow, his laughter and curiosity bringing a new energy to our home. One day, I got an email. It was from Emily. The message was short, almost apologetic. She congratulated me on my success, saying she had seen my name in an article about rising entrepreneurs. She wrote that she had made peace with her mistakes but would always regret losing me. She ended the email with a simple question. Could we talk sometime? I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the laptop. There was nothing left to say. Years later, I found myself sitting on our back porch, watching Caleb chase his younger sister, Lily, around the yard. Rachel sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on mine. "You okay?" she asked, noticing the faraway look in my eyes. I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Yeah," I said, feeling the truth of the words. "I'm more than okay." Because in the end, life had a way of rebuilding itself, piece by piece. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The end.